Thank you for viewing Minnesota Housing's training on Tenant Selection Plan Guidelines. Minnesota Housing is the state's housing finance agency. For more than 50 years, we've worked to provide access to safe, decent, and affordable housing to build stronger communities across the state. We believe that housing is the foundation for success, so we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance housing that is affordable. This training provides an overview of Minnesota Housing's Tenant Selection Plan Guidelines, which can be found on Minnesota Housing's website at www.mnhousing.gov/sites/multifamily/tenant selection plan. The Tenant Selection Plan, or TSP guidelines, accompany other resources we have made available to support our partners in understanding and complying with the expectations laid out. Our website includes links to relevant research as well as provides a checklist and help text to walk owners, management agents through TSP requirements and best practices. Note that owners and management agents are occasionally referred to as housing providers, and/or owners agents. We will cover the general scope of Minnesota Housing's TSP guidelines, the general consideration section, and to whom this section applies. We will also review the updates made in 2020 to incorporate explicit requirements for tenant screening criteria as they apply to all units, and tenant screening criteria as they apply to supportive housing units. Finally, we'll discuss the TSP review checklist and help text, which are tools that owners' management agents can use to construct a TSP that complies with Minnesota Housing's TSP guidelines. Note that the help text covers both Minnesota Housing's TSP guidelines as well as the TSP expectations of federal funding sources Minnesota Housing administers and/or monitors for TSP compliance. This training, however, only covers Minnesota Housing's TSP guidelines. Also note that throughout this tutorial, Minnesota Housing will often be referred to as agency. Minnesota Housing adopted new TSP guidelines in December 2020. The goal of these recent updates is to offer more guidance around creating greater success for tenants who may face barriers to housing because of restrictive screening criteria. Almost all properties financed with Minnesota Housing Program and funding sources now must have a written TSP. The applicable program and funding sources table can be found on the TSP webpage mentioned previously. The applicable funding sources link identifies to which programs the December 2020 guidelines apply. For programs and funding sources that are not required to follow agency TSP guidelines, you are still encouraged to use the guidelines to develop a TSP. Local municipalities may have their own tenant screening criteria requirements that may be more restrictive than Minnesota Housing's guidelines. Follow the most restrictive guidelines required by the funding sources or local municipality. There are two main sections of the Tenant Selection Plan guidelines: the General Consideration section and the Tenant Screening Criteria section. The general considerations are now requirements that apply to all Minnesota housing finance projects that are required to have a TSP. The tenant screening criteria applies to all projects that were financed as a result of a funding application submitted to Minnesota Housing after March 31, 2021. Projects that were funded based on an application for financing submitted to Minnesota Housing prior to March 31, 2021 are not mandated to follow the new screening criteria, but are still encouraged to incorporate them as best practice. You will notice that some guidelines found in both sections have elements that must be included and other elements that are encouraged to be incorporated as best practice. Once again, the general consideration section of the TSP applies to all Minnesota housing finance projects that are required to have a written TSP. Written Tenant Selection Plan. When drafting a TSP, owner's agents should always consider the applicant, who is the intended audience for the TSP. An applicant should be able to request and read the TSP to see if they qualify for housing. The TSP must be made available to the applicant before they apply and pay their application fee. The TSP must also be readable and accessible, including for those with limited English proficiency. Waiting list. If there are waiting list processes that will apply at the property, the TSP should describe how the waiting list will operate. Eligibility. The TSP should clearly outline any eligibility requirements associated with the various funding sources and municipality expectations. Notice of denial and appeals process. If the tenant is denied housing, the owner agent must provide the applicant prompt written notice that states the criteria the applicant failed to meet and must offer an appeals process. The appeals process is an opportunity for the applicant to provide evidence of mitigating circumstances that would demonstrate the applicant's ability to be a successful tenant or correct inaccurate background checks. The appeals process and timeline must be clearly stated in the TSP, and the owner agent must notify the tenant in writing of the outcome of their appeal. Domestic Violence, Fair Housing, and VAWA. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was established to improve criminal, legal, and community-based responses to victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Federal programs such as Home, Section 811, and low-income housing tax credits are subject to policies set forth in VAWA. It is important to remember that applicants cannot be denied housing or lose their HUD-assisted housing because the applicant or resident is or has been a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and is otherwise qualified for admission. When making a leasing decision, owner's agents should not consider an applicant's adverse criminal, housing, or credit histories that may have stemmed from times of abuse. TSPs for properties funded by those federal programs mentioned above must detail applicant and tenant rights and obligations under VAWA, which are summarized in Chapter 8 of the Tenant Selection Plan Help Text document, which can be found on our website at www.mnhousing.gov/sites/multifamily/tenant selection plan. Victims of domestic violence who are applicants or residents of properties that are not subject to VAWA are nonetheless protected from housing discrimination by the Fair Housing Act. Written Reasonable Accommodations Policy. TSPs must outline or reference a reasonable accommodations policy, and the policy must be made available upon request to applicants. A reasonable accommodation is defined as, quote, a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that may be necessary for a person with a disability to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling, including public and common spaces, end quote. Additionally, owner's agents must not raise barriers for individuals with disabilities, such as requiring them to live independently. Cannot discriminate against voucher holders. Owner's agents are not permitted to refuse to lease a unit to or discriminate against a prospective resident because the prospective resident has a housing choice voucher or any other form of tenant-based rental assistance. This must be stated explicitly in the TSP. HUD guidance on criminal history screening. When screening an applicant for criminal history, HUD offers guidelines that should be included in TSPs. These guidelines are relevant to all properties funded by Minnesota Housing. First, arrests only without conviction are not an allowable reason for an applicant's rejection. This must be stated explicitly in the TSP. Second, owner agents cannot reject all applicants who have been convicted of a crime. Instead, a provider must distinguish between convictions that indicate a demonstrable risk to tenants and/or property and those that do not. HUD also recommends that providers consider the nature and severity of the conviction and the amount of time that has passed since the conviction. Finally, HUD encourages providers to consider mitigating circumstances surrounding an applicant's criminal history, such as the person's age at the time of conviction, factors or circumstances surrounding the criminal conduct, evidence of good rental history prior to and after the conviction, and rehabilitation efforts made by the applicant. Properties funded by Minnesota Housing as a result of a funding application submitted after March 31, 2021, will be subject to more explicit screening criteria expectations, which will be explained shortly. Supportive housing considerations. Many projects financed by the agency include units designated to serve supportive housing populations. This includes high-priority homeless, HPH, and people with disabilities, PWD units, or for projects selected prior to 2018, long-term homeless, LTH units. TSPs must clearly state the intended populations for these units as well as their applicable referral sources. The goal for projects with supportive housing units is that the applicant screening criteria screen in households that the units are intended to serve, rather than raise barriers to entry. As such, applicants for supportive housing units will possibly have histories that include issues such as lengthy periods of homelessness or housing instability, evictions, lease terminations, criminal convictions, or mental or chemical health problems that impacted their rental, criminal, or credit history. Supportive housing providers, therefore, are encouraged to adopt flexible and lenient criteria regarding these common barriers when crafting TSPs. Records retention best practices. Minnesota Housing encourages owners' agents to maintain records of applicant denials and appeals. This helps ensure that tenancy determinations and appeals processes are being conducted in a non-discriminatory manner. Incorporating a records retention policy is not a requirement, it is a recommendation. The agency does not have certain standards or expectations regarding applicant records retention policies, but remember to defer to funding sources and specific program criteria that may outline requirements. As previously mentioned, while the general considerations we just reviewed apply to all properties that are required by the agency to have a TSP, the following tenant screening criteria are encouraged for all. Note, however, that they are required only for projects selected for financing as the result of a funding application submitted to Minnesota Housing after March 31, 2021. Some of these criteria will apply to all units in the property, but we will also review screening criteria expectations that will specifically apply to designated supportive housing units in the property. Supplemental evidence. For all housing units, the TSP must state that an applicant provide additional information with the completed application to explain, justify, or negate the relevance of potentially negative information that may be revealed by screening, and that the applicant believes to be relevant to the applicant's predicted performance as a tenant. The review of this information may occur after reviewing the screening report to assist the owner agent in considering all circumstances related to the applicant's history. This information must be evaluated before a final determination of acceptance or denial of an applicant, and must also consider all of the following: the nature and severity of incidents that would lead to a denial, the number and type of incidents, the time that has elapsed since the date the incidents occurred, the age of the individual at the time the incidents occurred, and the extent to which the applicant has taken all reasonable steps to prevent or mitigate any negative history. The owner agent should also consider any reasonable accommodations at this time. Credit history. For all housing units that are not supportive housing, an owner agent must apply screening criteria that do not reject an applicant for credit score by itself. However, information within a credit report that is directly relevant to tenant qualification can be relied upon by a landlord. Additionally, insufficient credit history cannot form the basis for rejection of an applicant, unless the applicant in bad faith withholds credit history information that might otherwise form a basis for denial. Housing history. For all housing units that are not supportive housing, an owner agent must apply screening criteria that do not reject an applicant for an eviction action if the action was dismissed or resulted in judgment for the applicant before the applicant submits the application. This also applies to an eviction action that resulted in a judgment against the applicant that was entered 3 or more years before the applicant submits the application. The screening criteria must also reflect that applicants will not be rejected for insufficient rental history unless the applicant in bad faith withholds rental history information that might otherwise form a basis for denial. Income to rent ratio. If a minimum income test is used, the income to rent ratio cannot exceed 2.5 times the rent. Note that Minnesota Housing does not have a minimum income requirement. The following screening criteria must apply for all supportive housing units, which means any units with supportive services that are restricted or set aside to serve households or people experiencing homelessness, or those that have a disability, including high-priority homeless and people with disabilities units. Many households for whom supportive housing units are intended to serve have experienced periods of unstable employment, homelessness, and/or mental health or chemical health challenges that may be reflected in their rental and criminal history. These updated screening criteria are responsive to the challenges and barriers that households prioritized for supportive housing units have faced that can often be mitigated through the presence of stable housing, rental assistance, and supportive services. These criteria include housing first, and adherence to housing first principles which are linked within this presentation. These principles focus on stable housing as the foundation for pursuing other goals and thus emphasize removing barriers to accessing housing, including adopting more lenient screening criteria. Housing history. Additionally, applicants for supportive housing units and properties financed by Minnesota Housing cannot be screened out based on housing history. While owners' agents can review rental history, they cannot screen out prospective supportive housing tenants based on references from previous landlords and money owed to previous landlords. However, recent egregious activity, including abusive treatment of staff or residents, or other extremely disruptive behavior may be considered. Credit history and income to rent ratio. Applicants for supportive housing units cannot be screened out based on credit history, and no income to rent ratio can be required, although the household income can be reviewed to assess ability to afford rent. Criminal history. When screening applicants for supportive housing units, an owner agent cannot reject an applicant for any of the following reasons. Any arrest for an inactive case or cases that did not result in conviction. Participation in or completion of a diversion or a deferral of judgment program, including stays of adjudication and continuances for dismissal or without prosecution. Any conviction that has been vacated or expunged, or for which the applicant received a stay of imposition of sentencing and complied with the terms of the stay. Any conviction for a crime that is no longer illegal in the state of Minnesota. Any conviction or any other determination or adjudication in the juvenile justice system. Any convictions for petty misdemeanors, prostitution, alcohol-related crimes, or low-level property crimes such as theft. Any conviction for misdemeanor offenses older than 2 years. Any criminal conviction for a felony offense or offenses older than 7 years. However, a landlord may deny an applicant who has been convicted of the illegal manufacture or distribution of a controlled substance as defined in Section 102 of the Controlled Substances Act, 21 U.S.C. 802, the link available in the TSP help text, or for those same offenses that mandate denial of tenancy in federally assisted housing subject to federal regulations, including but not limited to when any member of the household is subject to a lifetime sex offender registration requirement under a state sex offender registration program. To assist owners, agents in developing a TSP that reflects the guidelines reviewed in this training, Minnesota Housing has created a TSP checklist. The checklist acts as a guide to show what each individual property must adhere to in terms of state and/or federal requirements, with additional detail and context provided in the help text for each TSP requirement. The checklist is an easy way for owners, agents, and Minnesota Housing staff to identify what criteria are applicable to each property. It also aids in consistency of TSP review and acts as a tool for agency partners to help ensure their TSP contains the elements required by state and/or federal guidance. TSP Review Checklist. To assist owners, agents in developing a TSP that reflects the guidelines reviewed in this training, Minnesota Housing has created a TSP checklist. The checklist acts as a guide to show what each individual property must adhere to based on Minnesota Housing guidelines, as well as the TSP requirements of federal funding sources that we administer and monitor for TSP compliance. The checklist is an easy way for owners, agents, and Minnesota Housing staff to identify what criteria are applicable to each property. It also aids in consistency of TSP review and acts as a tool for agency partners to help ensure their TSP contains the elements required by state and/or federal guidance. The help text that accompanies the checklist mirrors the order of the checklist and provides additional context to both Minnesota Housing's TSP guidelines as well as the TSP expectations of federal funding sources Minnesota Housing administers that have TSP requirements. This slide provides a snapshot of what the checklist looks like. The owner-agent, housing provider, should complete the blue sections. A key starting point is to indicate to what programs the property is subject. Once you determine that detail, follow the cells that have an X to determine which sections apply to your project. This will also determine the elements Minnesota Housing staff assigned to review the TSP will be looking for. At the top of this slide, you will see a reference to the TSP webpage. There you will find the following resources designed to assist you with the checklist. The help text that aligns with the checklist, but with more detail. A recorded training on how to use this checklist, and a PDF of the training slides with script. Prior to its release, drafts of the TSP checklist and help text were piloted by Minnesota Housing Asset Management and Supportive Housing staff, as well as a handful of the agency's management agent partners. This process helped identify and address early issues, and feedback has been incorporated into the TSP checklist and help text. Both internal and external stakeholders reported that these tools are helpful, but please note that we continue to welcome feedback on their functionality and ways to improve them. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about Minnesota Housing's Tenant Selection Plan Guidelines. TSPs are a tool to help ensure that households know what housing is available and how they can access it. If you have questions about the material presented in this training, or have feedback on the TSP checklist or help text that accompany our guidelines, email Tenant Selection Plan Support at state.mn.us.